Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into torchlit corridors where footsteps are softened by tapestries and power moves only when no one is looking. You're standing just outside a throne room, feeling the low vibration of authority through stone floors, knowing full well the crown you see isn't always the crown that rules. Somewhere nearby, a queen waits, not on the throne, but close enough to touch it if she needs to. You probably won't survive this with your naive belief that power always announces itself loudly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where these late-night journeys land. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't start this story with a crown lowered onto a woman's head. That would be too obvious. Instead, you start with the ache in your jaw from smiling at the wrong person for too long, the practiced stillness of your hands folded just so, and the awareness that every eye in the room is trained on the king, while yours quietly study everyone else. You are a queen, yes, but not the kind history textbooks like to explain. You understand early on that crowns attract storms. Influence, on the other hand, slips through cracks. The mainstream historical fact you bump into almost immediately is simple and uncomfortable. In most monarchies, queens consort held no formal ruling power at all. Laws, councils, and succession rules made that abundantly clear. And yet somehow, policy shifted after private conversations. Wars were avoided after sleepless nights in shared beds, and ministers found themselves promoted or exiled after displeasing the wrong woman. That disconnect between law and reality is where you live now. You learn fast that visible authority is brittle. Kings who ruled loudly were often overthrown loudly. Queens who ruled quietly tended to die in their beds, surrounded by grandchildren and very selective memories. You watch coronations like someone watching fireworks. Impressive, dangerous, and over far too quickly. The real work happens later, when the crowds are gone and the ruler is exhausted, unsure, and human. Your first lesson comes from observation. You notice how often men in power seek reassurance. Not advice, reassurance. A council might argue, a general might warn, but you listen. And when you speak, you do it softly, framing ideas as comfort rather than command. You're right to worry, you say. Anyone would. And just like that, the direction of a kingdom nudges sideways. Historians still argue whether queens consciously planned this kind of shadow rule or whether it evolved instinctively as a survival strategy. Some scholars insist these women were master strategists playing multidimensional chess. Others argue it was improvisation under pressure. Clever, yes, but reactive rather than grandly designed. You suspect the truth is messier because power always is. There's a quirky tidbit you pick up early on, usually shared with a raised eyebrow by a court insider. Many queens deliberately cultivated reputations for harmlessness. Some pretended to be dull, others leaned hard into religious devotion or domestic obsession. One medieval queen was described by a chronicler as pleasantly vacant, while her private letters reveal a woman coordinating alliances with frightening precision. The performance mattered. Being underestimated wasn't an insult, it was armor. You begin to understand that the throne is less a seat of power and more a spotlight. Anyone sitting there becomes a target, so you stand just outside the beam, letting someone else absorb the heat. When things go wrong, and they always do, it's rarely your name shouted in the streets. That's not cowardice, that's longevity. You feel the rhythm of court life slow your breathing. Morning audiences, midday prayers, endless meals where nothing is eaten and everything is noticed. You learn who interrupts whom, who waits, who never waits, These micro moments become your map. You don't need authority when you have timing. And here comes your first light joke, because even shadow rulers need one. If court politics were a modern group chat, you'd be the one on mute, screenshotting everything, while everyone else argues in all caps. Relaxing, right? One of the earliest queens to embody this kind of invisible influence is Queen Emma of Normandy in the 11th century. Officially, she was wife to 2 kings and mother to 2 more. Unofficially, she was a political constant across violent regime changes. She didn't rule on parchment, but she survived invasions, switched allegiances with breathtaking calm, and ensured her sons inherited thrones others died for. Chroniclers couldn't quite explain how she kept winning, so they mostly didn't. You notice something else too. Shadow rule requires restraint. You can't correct every mistake. You can't win every argument. Sometimes you let a bad decision happen because stopping it would expose your hand. That patience feels like holding your breath underwater. Uncomfortable, but necessary. There's a fringe theory some historians love to debate late at night, that queens were often better informed than kings because they listened more than they spoke. Servants talked around you, courtiers relaxed near you, people assumed you were safe. You collected information the way others collected titles. Whether intentional or accidental, it worked. You start to feel the emotional cost of this life. You are always present, rarely acknowledged, praised for loyalty, blamed for manipulation, loved publicly for your silence, privately resented for your insight. But you also notice something quietly satisfying when a decision goes exactly the way you suggested weeks earlier and no one connects it to you. You sleep very well that night. Your second joke drifts in, half asleep. It turns out gaslighting didn't start on the internet. It started in palaces with really good curtains. Another mainstream fact settles in. Many queens who wielded the most influence left behind the fewest official records. Not because they did nothing, but because writing things down creates evidence. You rely on memory, oral promises, favors owed, power that can't be archived, can't be prosecuted. Historians still argue whether this invisibility has distorted our understanding of monarchy itself. Were kings truly sole rulers, or were they figureheads buoyed by unseen partnerships? You lean toward the second option because you've seen how often a ruler reaches sideways before stepping forward. As the nights pass, you grow comfortable with being indispensable but deniable. When success comes, it belongs to the crown. When failure hits, it misses you by inches. That's the bargain you've made. And just before you drift deeper into this world, one last quirky detail slips in like a whisper. Several queens deliberately avoided learning to read publicly, even when they could, because illiteracy lowered expectations. Private tutors, hidden libraries, knowledge tucked away like contraband. It's hard to fear a woman you believe can't understand you. By now, you're settling into the truth this section promised you'd feel, that power without crowns isn't weaker, it's quieter. And quiet, as you're starting to realize, lasts much longer. You don't leave the palace when night falls, you move deeper into it. Corridors narrow, voices soften, and the real negotiations begin not in council chambers, but behind doors that close with practiced gentleness. You learn quickly that bedrooms are not places of rest here. They are offices without minutes, war rooms without maps, confessionals without absolution. You lie awake beside a ruler who has spent the day pretending certainty. Now, in the dark, certainty drains out of him like heat from stone. This is where your influence sharpens. The mainstream historical fact you brush against is uncomfortable but undeniable. Many major political decisions were shaped in intimate spaces, not formal assemblies. Kings discussed treaties, executions, and alliances with their queens long before those matters ever reached advisors. What was presented later as decisive leadership often began as whispered doubt. You notice how power changes when armor comes off, literally and metaphorically. A man who ignored 5 counselors will ask you the same question 3 times, hoping for a different answer. You don't rush him. Silence is a tool here. You let him talk himself into the truth while you guide the shape of it, nudging with questions rather than commands. "And what happens if you don't?" you ask softly. It sounds harmless. It isn't. Historians still argue whether queens manipulated their husbands deliberately or whether they simply became emotional anchors in unstable systems. The debate gets heated in academic circles, but lying here in the dark, you know it doesn't matter. Influence doesn't require malicious intent, only proximity and patience. A quirky tidbit drifts in from the margins of court gossip. Several medieval and early modern palaces were designed with adjoining bedchambers connected by private doors, specifically to encourage these nocturnal consultations. Officially, it was about marital harmony. Unofficially, it was about access. Whoever heard the ruler last often won. You begin to understand that persuasion works best when it feels like relief. You don't argue, you soothe. You frame difficult choices as inevitable, kinder options as merciful, and your own preferred outcome as the least exhausting path forward. Kings, like everyone else, are deeply motivated by the desire to stop thinking for just one moment. There's a subtle art to timing. You don't bring up politics immediately. First, you talk about the day, the mood, the insult that still stings. You validate feelings before steering actions. It's almost modern therapy minus the clipboard and plus a kingdom. Your first light joke of the section slips in. Turns out the world's oldest leadership coaching program involved candles and very bad mattresses. You see this dynamic play out famously with Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose marriages to 2 kings placed her at the emotional center of European power. Officially constrained, she nonetheless influenced crusades, rebellions, and succession plans. Some historians portray her as dangerously manipulative. Others argue she was simply intelligent in a system that gave her no formal outlet. You suspect she was both, depending on the night. The bedroom also offers plausible deniability. Ideas born here appear later as a ruler's own insight. You never say, "You should." You say, "You once mentioned," and let his ego finish the job. When questioned later, he believes, truly, that the decision was his. That belief is essential. Power borrowed openly is fragile. Power gifted invisibly is defended fiercely. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens intentionally cultivated emotional dependence in their husbands. Some letters suggest deliberate reinforcement of insecurity. Others read like genuine concern. Historians still argue whether this was strategy or intimacy, blurred by circumstance. You think it's impossible to separate the two. When survival depends on closeness, affection becomes political, whether you like it or not. You also learn restraint here. You don't win every night. Sometimes you listen and say nothing, letting him choose poorly. That hurts, but it preserves trust. If every conversation ends in your victory, suspicion creeps in. Shadow rule thrives on subtlety, not dominance. Your second joke floats by, sleepy and dry. If these beds could talk, half the history books would need to be rewritten and heavily redacted. You notice another pattern. Kings often speak more freely when they think they are confessing weakness. Doubt feels safe here. Anger feels justified. You don't challenge those emotions directly, you redirect them. Rage becomes resolve. Fear becomes caution. Love becomes loyalty. To you, and by extension, to your vision. There's a lesser-known tidbit scholars love. Some queens deliberately feigned sleep during late-night monologues, letting kings talk themselves into decisions while believing they were alone with their thoughts. Whether myth or method, it reveals something essential. Being underestimated, even in intimacy, can be powerful. By now, you're fluent in the language of half-sentences and sighs. You know when to touch a hand, when to turn away, when to let silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. You shape the night, and the night shapes the future. As dawn creeps in, you return to your public role, composed, distant, ornamental. No one sees the work you've done. That's fine. The kingdom moves differently now, and only you know why. And as you drift forward into the next layer of this shadowed rule, you carry one truth with you. Daylight belongs to crowns, but darkness belongs to those who know how to listen. By morning, you've already ruled the world once. No one noticed. Now you move through sunlight with the careful ease of someone carrying secrets in their sleeves. This is where ink replaces whispers, and distance becomes its own kind of weapon. You discover that letters, when written carefully enough, can travel farther than armies and linger longer than spoken orders. The mainstream historical fact waiting for you here is undeniable. Royal correspondence shaped diplomacy across centuries. Queens wrote to fathers, brothers, former husbands, abbots, and foreign courts, often bypassing official channels entirely. These weren't love notes or polite updates. They were parallel lines of command, treaties stalled or accelerated based on what arrived sealed in wax, not what was announced from a throne. You learn to write with layers. On the surface, your letters sound affectionate, deferential, even dull. Underneath, every phrase carries instruction. You reference shared memories to trigger loyalty, invoke faith to apply moral pressure, and sprinkle just enough concern to make refusal feel cruel. "I worry for your soul," you write, which everyone understands as "choose wisely." Historians still argue whether queens were granted this freedom because men underestimated them or because rulers actively relied on their softer diplomatic reach. Some scholars see letters as loopholes, others as officially sanctioned tools. You suspect both can be true at once. Systems often survive by pretending they're not being bent. A quirky tidbit drifts in from archive margins. Several queens used invisible ink made from lemon juice or milk long before it was common in espionage law. Heat revealed what politeness concealed. Servants were instructed never to read letters aloud, only to deliver them sealed. Trust here was compartmentalized. You notice how delay itself becomes a tactic. A letter sent too quickly looks desperate, too slowly, and it insults. You time replies like breaths. When you want action, you write immediately. When you want someone to stew, you wait weeks. Distance gives you plausible innocence. After all, messengers get lost, ships sink, horses go lame. Your first light joke slips in dry as parchment. The original "seen at 2:14 a.m." Anxiety started with royal couriers and really bad roads. You think of Catherine de' Medici, whose correspondence network rivaled any intelligence service of her time. Officially a regent only briefly, she remained influential through letters long after her formal authority waned. She wrote constantly, sometimes multiple versions of the same letter to different recipients, each nudging events in her favor. Some historians call this manipulation, others call it survival in a hostile court. You call it literacy weaponized. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens intentionally cultivated ambiguity in writing to avoid accountability. Phrases like, "perhaps," "it may be wise," or "one might consider," appear constantly. Historians still argue whether this was feminine convention or strategic fog. You know it works because it leaves room to deny intent while still guiding outcomes. You also learn what not to write. Some things stay oral, Some instructions pass through trusted hands, memorized and destroyed. Paper lasts too long. People can be persuaded to forget, ink cannot. You burn drafts, tear pages, and keep only what flatters you if discovered. Your second joke floats by quietly. Nothing says sleep well like knowing your entire political strategy fits inside a handbag and could be dropped in a puddle. You sense how correspondence creates intimacy across borders. Foreign rulers who never meet you feel they know you. They confide fears they'd never share with ambassadors. You become a familiar presence in distant courts, a voice they trust more than their own advisors. That familiarity is power. There's another quirky detail scholars love. Queens often wrote in multiple languages, switching mid-letter to exclude certain readers. A paragraph in Latin for clergy, one in French for kin, a cryptic phrase in a regional dialect only one person would understand. Multilingualism wasn't decoration, it was filtration. As replies return, you read not just words but tone, who writes back quickly, who avoids specifics, who suddenly invokes God too often. These patterns tell you more than armies ever could. You adjust accordingly, nudging pressure points without ever appearing to touch them. Historians still argue whether this invisible epistolary rule was more effective than formal diplomacy. Some claim letters merely reflected decisions already made. Others insist they shaped those decisions fundamentally. You lean toward the latter because you've watched a single paragraph undo months of negotiation. By now you're aware that power exercised at a distance feels safer. No raised voices, no witnesses, just influence traveling silently across borders, arriving folded and sealed, pretending to be harmless. As you finish your last letter for the night, you blot the ink, fold the page, and press the seal. The future waits patiently for delivery. You step back into public view now, where everything looks ceremonial and nothing is accidental. This is the realm where marriage is praised as romance, but practiced as architecture. You feel the weight of jewels, fabric, expectation, layers meant to distract from the fact that this union was never about affection. It was about position, timing, and leverage that could last a lifetime. The mainstream historical fact anchoring you here is unavoidable. Royal marriages were diplomatic contracts first, and personal relationships second, if they were personal at all. Queens entered unions designed to secure borders, calm rival factions, or buy time between wars. Love, when it appeared, was treated as a pleasant but unnecessary side effect. You understand that from the moment vows are spoken, the real negotiations are only beginning. You quickly learn that marriage is not a single alliance but a series of renegotiations. On the wedding day, everyone believes the deal is done. You know better. Power shifts with pregnancies, miscarriages, heirs, illnesses, and scandals. Every change resets the board. You watch carefully because a queen who stops adjusting loses ground. Historians still argue whether queens had any meaningful agency in these arrangements. Some point to forced betrothals and teenage brides as proof of total powerlessness. Others note how many queens later outmaneuvered entire councils. You suspect agency wasn't given, it was taken slowly through adaptation rather than rebellion. There's a quirky tidbit court insiders loved whispering about. Some queens deliberately exaggerated marital harmony in public to increase their political value abroad. Foreign courts hesitated to offend a king whose marriage seemed strong, fearing the influence of a well-placed wife. Appearances weren't vanity, they were deterrents. You notice how ritual works in your favor. Processions, feasts, blessings, these things lock alliances into memory. People are less likely to break promises wrapped in spectacle. You lean into ceremony, understanding that tradition can be a form of soft enforcement. Once something feels sacred, it becomes harder to undo. Your first light joke drifts in gently. Nothing says romantic destiny like a marriage negotiated by 3 bishops, 2 generals, and a guy with a map. You think of Isabella of Castile, whose marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon united Spain while technically preserving separate crowns. On paper, they ruled jointly. In practice, Isabella exercised decisive influence, shaping policy, patronage, and religious direction. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand or Isabella was the dominant partner, which tells you everything you need to know. If scholars can't agree, she did her job well. Marriage also gives you access to networks previously closed. In-laws become informants. Dowries create obligations. Shared bloodlines soften borders. You learn to activate these ties quietly, calling in favors framed as family concern rather than political demand. No one likes to think they're being used. Everyone likes to think they're helping. There's a fringe debate about whether queens intentionally limited emotional closeness to maintain leverage. Some letters suggest strategic distance, others overflow with affection. Historians still argue whether love weakened or strengthened Queen's influence. You suspect it depended entirely on whether love came with listening. You also master patience here. Marriage binds you to someone who may rule for decades, or not at all. You prepare for both outcomes. You cultivate relationships with heirs, siblings and rivals, understanding that your role may outlast the man you married. That's not coldness. That's foresight. Your second joke slides in, soft and sleepy. Royal marriage was basically LinkedIn networking, but with more embroidery and significantly worse exit options. You feel the strain of performance. You smile through banquets, tolerate insults disguised as humor, and maintain an image of loyalty even when policy quietly bends under your guidance. The reward is stability, your own, and the kingdom's. You become indispensable not because you demand it, but because removing you would unravel too many threads. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens deliberately delayed consummation narratives, allowing rumors to swirl just long enough to keep foreign powers uncertain about succession. Uncertainty, you learn, is sometimes safer than clarity. Historians still argue whether marriage empowered queens or trapped them. You know the answer isn't either or. Marriage was a structure. What mattered was how well you learned to move inside it without rattling the beams. As the years pass, the wedding day fades into memory, but the alliance remains active, alive, responsive, and quietly guided by your hand. You're no longer just a bride. You're a fixture. And as you drift onward, you carry this truth with you. Marriages may begin with vows, but they are ruled by those who understand timing better than romance. You wake to the sound of bells, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Religion is everywhere now, woven into walls, calendars, and consciences. You kneel, bow your head, and let everyone see you do it. This is not weakness. This is camouflage. You learn quickly that faith, when displayed correctly, becomes one of the safest cloaks power can wear. The mainstream historical fact grounding you here is simple. Religion shaped law and legitimacy in nearly every pre-modern monarchy. Rulers claimed divine favor, and queens who appeared devout gained moral authority that no statute could revoke. Public piety made criticism dangerous. Who wants to attack a woman who looks like she's on speaking terms with God? You cultivate this image carefully. You attend services relentlessly. You fund monasteries. You sponsor saints' days and processions. Your name becomes associated with mercy, charity, and moral order. Behind the scenes, policy shifts, tax exemptions, land grants, appointments slide quietly into place under the banner of righteousness. Historians still argue whether queens were genuinely religious or strategically devout. Some point to personal prayer books filled with annotations as evidence of deep belief. Others note how conveniently devotion aligned with political needs. You suspect sincerity and strategy lived comfortably side by side. Faith doesn't stop being useful just because it's real. A quirky tidbit floats in from the margins. Several queens kept private chapels staffed by confessors who doubled as advisors. Confession, after all, is an intelligence goldmine. People reveal far more when they believe their souls are on the line. The trick is remembering what you hear without ever revealing how you learned it. You notice how moral language reframes authority. You don't oppose a policy, you question its righteousness. You don't demand loyalty, you encourage virtue. Resistance suddenly feels sinful rather than political. This is influence at its softest and strongest. Your first light joke sighs into the quiet. Nothing says do what I want, quite like adding, for the good of your soul. You think of Queen Blanche of Castile, whose visible devotion bolstered her authority during regency. Chroniclers praised her piety, even as she crushed rebellions and centralized power. Historians still argue whether her faith restrained her cruelty or justified it. From where you stand, it did something more important. It made her actions untouchable. Religion also gives you allies beyond the court. Abbots, bishops, and abbesses listen to you because you speak their language. You frame political concerns as spiritual ones, drawing the church into your orbit. When clerics echo your positions, it looks like consensus, not control. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens deliberately used religious guilt as leverage over kings. Letters hint at reminders of divine judgment during moments of doubt. Historians still argue whether this was manipulation or moral counsel. You know it worked because fear of God lasts longer than fear of rebellion. You practice restraint again. You never appear radical. You don't challenge doctrine publicly. You operate within accepted beliefs, nudging interpretation rather than doctrine. Radical piety scares people. Predictable devotion comforts them. Comfort builds trust. Your second joke drifts by, barely audible. Medieval PR was just incense, Latin, and really good timing. You also notice how charity becomes visibility without threat. Feeding the poor, funding hospitals, ransoming captives, these acts build loyalty that feels earned rather than enforced. People defend you not because you command them to, but because you helped them when no one else did. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens deliberately cultivated reputations as intercessors, women who pleaded with kings for mercy. Publicly, this softened their image. Privately, it reinforced their access. You become the doorway others need, which makes you impossible to ignore. Historians still argue whether this moral authority outlasted individual queens or merely filled gaps in weak systems. You think it did both. Structures bend to those who appear morally indispensable. As bells fade and candles gutter, you rise from prayer composed and unreadable. You have not issued an order, you have not signed a decree, and yet tomorrow decisions will feel heavier, gentler, and strangely aligned with what you believe is right. You move forward knowing this. In a world ruled by God, those who speak softly in His name rarely need to shout. You feel the shift before anyone announces it. Your body changes, your routines narrow, and suddenly the future has a heartbeat. Motherhood arrives not as a private milestone, but as a public event, watched, whispered about, and measured in dynastic value. You understand immediately that this is no longer just about lineage, it's about leverage that stretches decades ahead. The mainstream historical fact anchoring you here is stark. Producing heirs was considered a queen's primary duty, and failure to do so could mean exile, annulment, or worse. But once an heir existed, everything changed. A mother of a future king occupied a unique political position, protected, courted, and quietly feared. You are no longer replaceable. You are essential. You learn to think long. While others plan for the next season, you plan for the next reign. Education choices become political. Tutors matter. Languages matter. So does who holds the child when you're not there. You curate influences carefully, knowing that shaping a future ruler begins long before a crown is in sight. Historians still argue whether queens used motherhood intentionally as a political tool, or whether power simply accrued around them once children existed. Some scholars see calculated grooming, others see reactive protection. You suspect the truth sits in the sleepless middle, strategy sharpened by necessity. A quirky tidbit slips in from the quieter corners of palace life. Some queens insisted on choosing wet nurses from specific noble families, creating bonds of loyalty that lasted generations. Milk kinship, as it was sometimes called, wasn't sentimental, it was political insurance. You notice how your voice carries more weight now. You speak not just as a wife, but as a guardian of continuity. When you raise concerns, they're framed as maternal instinct rather than ambition. No one wants to argue against a mother thinking of the children, even when the children are heirs to entire realms. Your first light joke hums gently. It turns out nothing scares powerful men quite like a woman who says, "This affects my son." You think of Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, who never ruled as queen but orchestrated the end of a dynasty through her son's claim. Her influence operated through correspondence, alliances, and relentless focus on her child's future. Historians still argue whether she was devoutly cautious or ruthlessly ambitious. You notice no one questions her effectiveness. Motherhood also grants you endurance. You can wait, you must. Regents rise and fall, favourites come and go, but your investment is measured in years. You absorb slights quietly, storing them away like seeds. You don't need to win today if tomorrow belongs to your child. There's a fringe debate among scholars about whether queens exaggerated threats to their children to justify political moves. Letters speak of danger, plots, and divine warning. Historians still argue whether these fears were real or rhetorical. You know that in unstable courts, paranoia is often just pattern recognition with better instincts. You become skilled at appearing apolitical. You withdraw from overt influence at times, focusing publicly on nurseries and prayer while privately maintaining networks. This invisibility is temporary and strategic. You're not retreating, you're consolidating. Your second joke drifts in, soft and knowing. The nursery was just a war room with smaller furniture. You also learn the power of grief. If a child dies, and many do, you discover that sorrow can halt politics entirely. Mourning suspends criticism. Silence becomes sacred. Some queens leveraged this pause to reset alliances or remove threats. Others couldn't. Historians still argue where grief ended and calculation began. You suspect even grief learns to speak the language of power when survival is at stake. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens commissioned portraits of their children early and distributed copies to allies, subtly reinforcing claims and loyalty long before succession was relevant. Faces became reminders, promises gained shape. As years pass, you feel the center of gravity move. Decisions are no longer about pleasing a husband or stabilizing a reign. They're about ensuring inheritance of crown, reputation, and security. You don't need the throne now. You need the future to arrive intact. And as you drift onward, you hold this truth close. Queens who ruled from the shadows often did so with one hand resting gently on a cradle, already shaping the world their children would inherit. You don't always need to speak when others are willing to speak for you. This is where proxies come in, favorites, confidants, and the carefully chosen people who say the things you cannot. You watch them move through court like extensions of your will, absorbing attention while your influence remains pleasantly deniable. The mainstream historical fact anchoring you here is well documented. Courts were dominated by favorites, individuals with unusual access to the ruler. And queens often played key roles in their rise or fall. Whether ministers, lovers, or companions, these figures shaped policy while providing a buffer between power and accountability. You learn quickly that influence works best when it's wearing someone else's face. You choose proxies with care. Intelligence matters, but loyalty matters more. A brilliant fool is still a fool. A devoted average mind is far safer. You test them with small confidences, watching who leaks, who listens, and who reshapes your words to serve themselves. Trust, once broken, is never repaired, only replaced. Historians still argue whether queens deliberately controlled favourites or whether favourites manipulated queens. The sources are messy, biased, and often written by people who lost. You know the truth is rarely singular. Power attracts ambition, and alliances are always negotiations, not commands. A quirky tidbit from court gossip circles endlessly. Some queens deliberately elevated socially awkward or unpopular favourites because they posed less independent threat. A favourite no one liked had nowhere to turn except back to you. Cruel, perhaps. Effective, absolutely. Your first light joke slips in. Think of it as outsourcing, but with significantly higher betrayal risk and no HR department. You think of Madame de Pompadour, who, though not a queen, illustrates the principle perfectly. Queens observed how she wielded influence without formal authority, controlling access, patronage, and policy. Some queens adopted similar strategies, positioning trusted companions as gatekeepers while remaining publicly above the fray. Proxies allow you to test ideas safely. If a proposal fails, it wasn't yours, it was theirs. If it succeeds, you quietly support its continuation. This trial by proxy system lets you refine strategy without ever appearing reckless. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens intentionally encouraged rivalries among favourites to maintain control. Letters suggest subtle triangulation, but proof is elusive. Historians still argue whether this was paranoia or brilliance. You lean toward controlled chaos. It keeps everyone too busy watching each other to watch you. You also learn how to remove proxies when they become liabilities. You don't confront directly. You cool access. You redirect attention. You allow others to notice flaws you've quietly highlighted. When the fall comes, it looks organic. You remain untouched. Your second joke floats by, barely audible. The trick is finding someone ambitious enough to act, but not smart enough to realize they're replaceable. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens maintained entirely separate circles, religious, social, and political, that never overlapped. Proxies in one sphere knew nothing of the others. Compartmentalization wasn't paranoia, it was insulation. Historians still argue whether this indirect rule weakened institutional governance or stabilized it. Some claim it fostered corruption, others argue it prevented open conflict. You think it did both, depending on how carefully the strings were held. As years pass, you become less visible and more effective. Your name is rarely mentioned in debates, but outcomes increasingly align with your preferences. People come to you not for orders, but for signals, raised eyebrows, delayed invitations, sudden warmth. You move forward knowing this. The shadow ruler is rarely alone. She's surrounded by voices, all speaking slightly off-key, carefully tuned to echo her will without ever revealing its source. You discover that the most unsettling thing you can do in a noisy court is say nothing at all. While others rush to fill silence with promises, threats, or excuses, you let it hang, long enough for people to start hearing their own fears. Silence, you learn, is not absence. It's pressure. The mainstream historical fact guiding you here is subtle but consistent. Queens who survived volatile courts often did so by mastering restraint. Public outbursts, firm declarations, or visible ambition drew backlash. Silence, on the other hand, invited projection. Others spoke for you, worried about what you might be thinking. That uncertainty did the work. You practice stillness as a discipline. When accused, you don't immediately defend yourself. When praised, you accept without elaboration. When asked for opinion, you delay. This isn't passivity, it's calibration. Every pause forces others to reveal more than they intend. Historians still argue whether Queen's silences were interpreted accurately by contemporaries or misread entirely. Some scholars believe silence empowered women in constrained systems. Others argue it reinforced stereotypes of passivity. You know better. Silence isn't emptiness, it's a mirror. A quirky tidbit slips through the hush. Several queens cultivated reputations for being hard to read, which unsettled ambassadors trained to extract information. Diplomatic reports often mention frustration with queens who revealed nothing, a complaint that doubled as praise. Your first light joke drifts in softly. Silence, the original unread message that makes everyone spiral. You think of Queen Elizabeth I, whose silence was legendary. While she ruled openly, her strategic pauses, especially regarding marriage and succession, kept rivals guessing for decades. Historians still argue whether her indecision was calculated or emotional. You suspect she understood exactly how much uncertainty she could afford. Silence also protects you from contradiction. If you haven't stated a position, you can't be accused of reversing it. You let others argue themselves into corners while you remain uncommitted, observing which arguments survive scrutiny and which collapse under pressure. There's a fringe debate about whether silence disproportionately benefited women because it aligned with expectations of modesty. Historians still argue whether this was exploitation of stereotype or submission to it. You think it was judo, using the system's own assumptions against it. Your second joke floats by, barely there. Sometimes the loudest move is not hitting send. You also learn when to break silence. Timing matters. When you finally speak, even a mild statement feels weighty. People lean in, they remember it. You don't waste these moments. You choose words that sound reasonable, even inevitable, so that agreement feels like common sense rather than concession. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens intentionally cultivated slow speech or long pauses, shaping court etiquette around their rhythms. Meetings lengthened, interruptions decreased, tempo became authority. Historians still argue whether this form of rule was sustainable or emotionally taxing. Some letters suggest exhaustion, isolation, and loneliness. Others reveal satisfaction in control without confrontation. You know both are true. Silence is powerful, but it's heavy. As you move forward, you feel your presence sharpen despite your quiet. People watch you more closely when you speak less. They interpret gestures, expressions, absences. You become a focal point without ever demanding attention, and you carry this truth with you. In a world addicted to noise, the person who controls silence controls the room. You notice that power doesn't always argue. It often curates fabric, color, sequence, who stands where and who waits how long. All of it speaks long before any words do. You step into this world dressed not just to be seen, but to be read. Fashion becomes grammar, ritual becomes punctuation. The mainstream historical fact grounding you here is well established. Royal courts were governed by strict etiquette systems, and queens often controlled or influenced these rules. Access, precedence, and appearance weren't trivial. They determined political rank. Changing a protocol could elevate or humiliate without a single accusation. You learn to edit the room the way others edit laws. You choose clothing deliberately. Colors signal allegiance, fabrics signal wealth or restraint. Mourning, black delays conversations. White suggests purity and renewal. You never dress randomly because nothing in court is random. Even simplicity is a statement. Historians still argue whether queens consciously used fashion as a political language or whether later observers are reading symbolism backward. Some dismiss it as vanity. Others see it as visual rhetoric. You know it worked because people reacted, sometimes more strongly than they did to decrees. A quirky tidbit drifts in. Queen Elizabeth owned thousands of dresses, many restricted by sumptuary laws that forbade others from wearing similar materials. Her wardrobe wasn't indulgence, it was enforcement. You don't need to fine people when silk already tells them where they stand. Your first light joke slips in. Medieval power dressing, because sometimes you don't need a sword, just really intimidating sleeves. Rituals matter just as much. You adjust seating at banquets, you change the order of procession, you invite someone to stand closer, wait longer, or leave earlier. These gestures ripple through the court faster than gossip. Everyone notices, no one complains openly because etiquette gives you plausible innocence. You think of Empress Theodora, whose mastery of court ceremony in Byzantium elevated her from actress to co-ruler. Historians still argue how much authority she wielded independently, but her control of ritual space made her presence unavoidable. When she entered a room, order reorganized itself. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens used fashion to distract from political weakness. Historians still argue whether spectacle compensated for limited authority or amplified existing power. You suspect it did both. Appearance doesn't replace influence, it magnifies it. Your second joke drifts by, soft and amused. Turns out dress for the job you want applied to ruling empires too. You also notice how ritual creates memory. People remember how they felt waiting, bowing, being seen, or not. Those emotions linger longer than policy details. You let others argue over law while you shape experience. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens intentionally revived archaic ceremonies to legitimize their authority, tying themselves to mythic pasts. Tradition, even invented tradition, feels harder to challenge than innovation. Historians still argue whether these symbolic controls were superficial or central to governance. You know the answer. When access equals power, controlling access is governance. As you move forward, you feel the weight of silk and silence doing their work. No orders given, no threats made. And yet everyone knows exactly where they stand. You carry this truth onward. Soft power isn't soft at all, it just leaves fewer fingerprints. You arrive as an outsider, even when the palace pretends to welcome you. New language, unfamiliar customs, jokes you don't yet understand. Foreign queens step into courts already half convinced of their own expendability. You feel eyes weighing how quickly you'll break, or how quietly you'll disappear. Survival here is the first victory. The mainstream historical fact shaping this moment is harsh. Foreign-born queens were often distrusted, scapegoated, and blamed for unrest. They represented alliances others resented. When things went wrong, bad harvests, military losses, political unrest, it was dangerously easy to blame the woman who wasn't from here. You learn that visibility can be fatal. Historians still argue whether foreign queens were inherently weaker or simply held to impossible standards. Some sources paint them as naive interlopers, others reveal remarkable adaptability. You know adaptation wasn't optional, it was the price of staying alive. You begin by listening. You learn which traditions are sacred and which are just habits. You observe how women move, speak, and disappear. You adopt local customs selectively, enough to appear respectful, not enough to lose yourself. Assimilation is a performance, not surrender. A quirky tidbit whispers through history. Several foreign queens deliberately exaggerated accents or cultural innocence to deflect suspicion while quietly building networks. Being underestimated bought time. Time bought control. Your first light joke drifts in gently. Moving courts was basically medieval study abroad, but with assassination attempts. You think of Marie de Medici, whose foreignness haunted her French reign. Officially queen and later regent, she relied heavily on proxies and patronage to compensate for hostility. Historians still argue whether her downfall was due to incompetence or xenophobia. You suspect both fed each other. You also learn to weaponize your origin. Foreign relatives become diplomatic bridges. Shared bloodlines open doors. You frame requests as cultural misunderstandings, softening demands that would provoke resistance from a native queen. In my homeland, you say, gently, and suddenly compromise feels polite. There's a fringe debate about whether foreign queens deliberately leaned into stereotypes to manipulate expectations. Historians still argue whether this was strategy or desperation. It often began as one and ended as the other. Your second joke floats by, sleepy and dry. Turns out being exotic is just branding medieval edition. You tread carefully. One misstep confirms every suspicion. So you move slower, quieter, letting others make mistakes first. You survive long enough to become familiar. Familiarity dulls fear. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some foreign queens never fully learned the local language in public, using translators even when fluent. Translation created distance and plausible deniability. Historians still argue whether foreign queens ever truly belonged. You think belonging is overrated. Influence doesn't require affection, only access. As you settle in, you feel the hostility soften into routine. You're no longer the stranger. You're the fixture no one remembers inviting, but no one can quite remove. And you carry this truth forward. In hostile courts, the quietest survival is often the strongest form of rule. You don't plan to rule openly, but sometimes the world insists. A king falls ill. An heir is too young. A war arrives at the worst possible moment. Suddenly the shadows thin and all eyes turn toward you. Not because they want you there, but because there's nowhere else to look. Regency is power with an expiration date, and you feel the clock start ticking the moment it begins. The mainstream historical fact anchoring you here is clear. Regencies were legally recognized periods when queens or queen mothers governed in the name of absent, incapacitated, or underage rulers. On paper, this was temporary stewardship. In practice, it was often the most dangerous and revealing phase of a queen's political life. Rule too weakly and you're dismissed. Rule too strongly and you're resented. Historians still argue whether regencies empowered queens or exposed them. Some see regency as proof that women could rule effectively when allowed. Others argue it triggered backlash precisely because it made female authority visible. You feel both truths pressing in at once. You move carefully. You keep councils intact, traditions respected, and rhetoric focused on duty rather than ambition. You frame every decision as preservation, not change. Until he comes of age, you repeat, like a spell. You understand that permanence terrifies people more than incompetence ever could. A quirky tidbit surfaces from the margins of royal law. Some queens deliberately refused grand titles during regency, signing documents on behalf of, rather than by authority. It looked humble, it wasn't. It reassured rivals while leaving outcomes unchanged. Your first light joke drifts in quietly. Temporary power has a funny way of making everyone permanently nervous. You think of Catherine de Medici again, whose regencies for her sons placed her at the center of French politics during religious wars. Officially, she mediated. In reality, she steered policy, appointed allies, and survived factions that expected her to fail. Historians still argue whether she prolonged conflict or prevented collapse. You suspect she did, whichever kept the throne intact. Regency forces you into visibility you've long avoided. You sign decrees, you receive ambassadors, you make decisions that can't be outsourced. It's exhausting, and you feel the difference immediately. Less deniability, more blame. The shadows were safer, but this is necessary. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens intentionally extended regencies beyond necessity, delayed coronations, prolonged minorities, convenient illnesses. Historians still argue whether these delays were manipulative or protective. You know, delay is often mercy dressed as caution. Your second joke slips in, almost a sigh. Nothing tests loyalty like a ruler everyone knows is temporary. You also learn how to retreat gracefully. The most skilled regents don't cling to power, they step back before they're pushed. You prepare the transition carefully, ensuring your influence survives even after your authority ends. You place allies, set precedents, and then vanish just enough to seem obedient. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens deliberately cultivated nostalgia for their regency years, allowing later chroniclers to remember stability rather than control. Memory, you realize, is the final battleground. Historians still argue whether regencies strengthened monarchies or destabilized them. You think they revealed the truth, that power is less about who sits on the throne and more about who knows how to keep it standing. As the crown passes to its rightful head, you step back into softer light. You are no longer ruling, but the system now moves according to rhythms you set. And you carry this truth forward. Sometimes, stepping into the light is not betrayal of shadow rule, but its final, necessary proof. You start to notice that the palace has ears everywhere, so you make sure some of them belong to you. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough that truth reaches you before rumor hardens into danger. Spies sound dramatic, but what you really rely on are people who already exist. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, tutors, priests, messengers. The invisible workforce of the court finally becomes visible to you. The mainstream historical fact anchoring you here is well supported. Royal courts depended heavily on informal intelligence networks, and queens were uniquely positioned to access them. Servants moved freely between rooms, overheard conversations, noticed patterns. While men debated policy in chambers, information flowed through corridors you were expected to occupy quietly. You listened. Historians still argue whether queens actively organized spy networks or simply benefited from proximity to information. Some records suggest deliberate coordination, others point to organic accumulation. You know it didn't matter how it started, only that you learned how to manage it. You treat servants well. That's not kindness alone, it's strategy. Loyalty grows where dignity is offered. You remember names. You notice exhaustion. You reward discretion. In return, information arrives unprompted, wrapped in casual remarks. You might want to know is how empires begin to shift. A quirky tidbit slips in from the back staircases of history. Some queens kept multiple ladies-in-waiting from rival factions on purpose, encouraging them to report on one another without ever realizing it. Competition sharpened honesty, or at least volume. Your first light joke murmurs in, turns out the original notification system was a maid clearing her throat at just the right moment. You also learn what not to ask. The best intelligence feels accidental. You let people talk themselves into revelations. You never react too strongly. Shock shuts mouths. Calm opens them. When you thank someone for information, you do it privately, and only once. You think of Anne of Austria, whose quiet intelligence networks during her regency helped her navigate hostile courts and powerful ministers. Historians still argue whether she was politically astute or merely well-informed. You know, those are the same thing, There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens weaponized domestic spaces intentionally. Kitchens, sewing rooms, nurseries, places men dismissed as harmless became information hubs. Historians still argue whether this was design or coincidence. You smile to yourself. Coincidence doesn't repeat this well. Your second joke drifts by, soft and amused. Espionage is just gossip with better memory. You also master containment. Information is dangerous if it spreads unchecked. You decide who needs to know and who absolutely does not. Sometimes you act on intelligence quietly, changing schedules, redirecting favors, preventing crises before anyone realizes they were possible. The absence of disaster becomes your signature. Another quirky detail surfaces. Some queens deliberately spread false information through trusted channels to identify leaks. When the lie resurfaced, the source revealed itself. Elegant, efficient, ruthless if necessary. Historians still argue whether these intelligence networks empowered queens beyond their intended roles or simply compensated for structural exclusion. You think exclusion created creativity. When doors close, listening becomes survival. As nights pass, you feel safer, not because threats vanish, but because they announce themselves early. You're no longer reacting, you're anticipating. And you carry this truth forward. Power doesn't always strike, it often overhears. You don't like to dwell on failure, but power that pretends it's infallible doesn't survive long. Eventually you reach the stories no one likes telling. The moments when shadow rule faltered, misjudged the room, or trusted the wrong silence. This is where the softness of invisibility turns sharp, and mistakes don't echo. They detonate. The mainstream historical fact grounding you here is uncomfortable but necessary. Many queens who ruled subtly still fell, exiled, imprisoned, or executed when their influence became too visible or too threatening. Informal power offered flexibility, but it lacked protection. When something went wrong, there were no legal safeguards, no titles to shield you. Only memory. And memory can be cruel. Historians still argue whether these failures were inevitable or avoidable. Some scholars claim the system was rigged against women regardless of strategy. Others argue specific miscalculations sealed certain fates. You know both can be true at once. The margin for error was thinner for you than for anyone else. You study the warning signs in hindsight. Influence that spreads too evenly becomes obvious. Silence that lasts too long starts to feel deliberate. Proxies grow arrogant. Allies forget who placed them. The shadow thickens and suddenly everyone notices how dark it is. A quirky tidbit surfaces from court rumour and post-mortem gossip. Several queens were undone by people who loved them, not enemies who hated them. A careless remark at a banquet, a confidant bragging to impress, a letter copied one too many times. Loyalty doesn't fail loudly, it slips. Your first light joke arrives with a sigh. Turns out the hardest thing to manage isn't enemies, it's friends with poor impulse control. You think of Anne Boleyn, whose influence over Henry VIII reshaped England, but ultimately outpaced her protection. Historians still argue whether her downfall was political, personal, or manufactured. You notice something simpler. Her power became visible before it became secure. That's the danger point. Once people can name your influence, they can target it. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens sometimes intentionally step too far, testing how much power they truly held. Historians still argue whether these were gambles or misreads. You suspect exhaustion played a role. Holding yourself in restraint year after year wears you down. Eventually, you want to speak plainly. That's often when things unravel. You also see failures of silence. Moments when not responding allowed rumors to harden into truth. When restraint looked like guilt. when absence looked like admission. Silence is powerful, but it isn't neutral. You must read the room constantly because yesterday's wisdom becomes today's liability. Your second joke floats by, darker but still gentle. The problem with ruling from the shadows is that when the lights come on, everyone squints at you first. Another quirky detail surfaces: some fallen queens attempted last-minute pivots, sudden piety, public humility, or dramatic confessions to regain sympathy. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Often, once a narrative sets, reversing it is like stopping a flood with a prayer. Historians still argue whether these failures changed future queens' strategies. You believe they did. Each collapse became a lesson passed quietly through behavior, not books. Less writing, fewer declarations, more patience. History doesn't just remember, it warns. You don't see these stories as deterrents, you see them as calibration. Power without risk doesn't exist. Shadow rule reduces danger, but it never eliminates it. Knowing when to pull back is just as important as knowing when to press forward. As you move on, you carry this truth with you. Invisibility protects, but only while it's believable. You begin to notice something unsettling as time stretches forward. The quieter your rule, the quieter your memory becomes. Victories without signatures fade. Influence without proclamations dissolves into footnotes or disappears entirely. This is the cost of shadow power. It works beautifully in the moment and vanishes just as efficiently afterward. The mainstream historical fact anchoring you here is blunt. History was largely written by men who valued formal authority, military triumphs, and legal titles. Queens who ruled indirectly left fewer records by design, and later chroniclers often minimized or erased their roles entirely. Absence of evidence was treated as evidence of absence. You feel that injustice settling in centuries later. Historians still argue whether this erasure was intentional or structural. Some claim chroniclers deliberately downplayed female influence to preserve ideological order. Others argue that informal power simply left fewer traces. You know the truth leans toward both. Silence protects in life, but it betrays you in death. You watch later writers describe powerful queens as nagging wives, overbearing mothers, or mysterious background figures. Influence becomes personality flaw. Strategy becomes temperament. When outcomes succeed, kings receive credit. When they fail, whispers of feminine interference surface conveniently late. A quirky tidbit slips in from revisionist scholarship. Some queens were retroactively blamed for decisions they privately opposed, simply because later generations needed a villain that fit existing biases. Being invisible made it easy to assign you any motive history required. Your first light joke drifts in, tinged with irony. Turns out ghostwriting your own reign really does make you a ghost. You think of Queen Henrietta Maria, long portrayed as meddlesome and foreign, her behind-the-scenes influence flattened into caricature. Historians still argue whether she destabilized England or merely operated within constraints few acknowledged. You notice how rarely her strategic restraint is mentioned, only her perceived excess. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens intentionally accepted historical erasure as the price of safety. Historians still argue whether legacy mattered less than survival. You suspect many chose living influence over remembered authority. A name in a book is cold comfort if you don't live long enough to earn it. You also see how myths replace nuance. Later generations prefer simple stories, strong kings, weak queens, clear villains. Shadow rule resists simplification. It asks readers to sit with ambiguity, and most don't want to, so you're smoothed out, simplified, or erased. Your second joke floats by softly. History books love a headline, not a subplot that secretly ran the entire show. Another quirky detail surfaces. In some cases, Queen's influence survived only in household records, expense lists, wardrobe notes, marginalia, places historians once ignored. The quietest documents turned out to be the loudest proof, if anyone bothered to look. Historians still argue whether modern scholarship can ever fully recover these lost forms of power. You think recovery is possible, but incomplete. Some silences were intentional, some truths were never written down. Shadow rule leaves shadows behind. As you drift toward the end of this long arc, you feel a strange calm. You didn't rule to be remembered. You ruled to endure, to stabilize, to protect futures that weren't yours to see. That matters, even if it isn't celebrated. And you carry this truth forward. Power that shapes the world doesn't always survive the story, but it survives the world it shaped. You reach the quietest point of all, not silence this time, but echo. The kind that lingers after footsteps have passed and the corridor remembers you longer than people do. You are older now, or at least the world thinks you are. In truth, you've simply learned when to stop moving and let what you built keep breathing on its own. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this final stretch is almost poetic. Many queens who ruled from the shadows lived long enough to watch their methods outlast them. Institutions hardened around habits they introduced. Advisors learned new rhythms. Courts adjusted to patterns that no longer required your presence. Power, once set in motion properly, doesn't need constant correction. Historians still argue whether these queens truly shaped future governance or merely adapted to it. Some scholars see continuity, others see coincidence. You smile at that debate because systems rarely admit who taught them how to behave. You feel it most clearly when younger women arrive at court. They don't ask you questions directly, they watch you, they notice when you speak and when you don't. They learn that stillness can be instructive, that patience can be lethal, that invisibility can be chosen rather than imposed. You've become a reference point without ever becoming a legend. A quirky tidbit surfaces from late court life. Some queens intentionally simplified their routines in later years, reducing appearances and ceremonial presence while maintaining private access. People mistook this for decline. It wasn't. It was refinement. Your first light joke arrives, barely there. Turns out retirement just means ruling on airplane mode. You notice how power softens when it's no longer threatened. You no longer need to maneuver constantly. You've placed enough people, shaped enough habits, seeded enough expectations. The machine runs. That's the dream, really. Not dominance, but durability. There's a fringe scholarly debate about whether queens ever consciously planned legacies or simply hoped their influence would stick. Historians still argue whether intentional design or accumulated habit mattered more. You think legacy is what happens when you stop touching something and it doesn't fall apart. Your second joke drifts in, warm and amused. The best mic drop is leaving the room before anyone realizes you were holding the microphone. You watch history begin to forget you in real time. Names fade, credit shifts, stories simplify. Strangely, it doesn't hurt. You were never performing for applause. You were stabilizing something fragile. That kind of success doesn't need witnesses. You sense the long echo now, not of your voice, but of your choices. A kingdom that transitions smoothly. A council that hesitates before acting rashly. A ruler who pauses before speaking. These pauses are yours. They're the imprint you leave behind. Historians still argue whether shadow rule was a limitation or a triumph. You know the answer is both and neither. It was adaptation. It was survival. It was mastery of a system that didn't intend to make room for you. And now, at the end, you let go. Not dramatically, not publicly. You simply stop adjusting the pieces and trust that the board remembers where they belong. The world continues, quietly, successfully. And as everything slows, as the echoes soften and the corridors empty, you let the tension ease out of your shoulders, your breathing lengthen, your thoughts drift into softer focus. Power is no longer something you hold, it's something you once shaped, and now it rests, steady and unbothered. Nothing is chasing you. Nothing needs fixing tonight. The shadows are calm. So are you. Now, dim the lights inside your mind. Let the noise of history blur into a gentle hum and allow sleep to take over. Because the work is done, the echoes are safe, and there is nothing left for you to carry.